Hey Ecofictologists, welcome back to my channel where we talk about all things reading and writing ecofiction. My name is Lovis and today I am bringing you a book review of The Animals of Farthing Wood by Colin Dann, which is another example of anthropomorphic fantasy. It is a series, but I am just talking about the first book published in 1979. You might recognize it from the TV series it was adapted for in the 90s. That seems to really have taken off. If you want more details on what anthropomorphic fantasy is, you can check out the video that I dedicated entirely to this subject. I'll link that above somewhere. But in brief, anthropomorphism is when we assign kind of human characteristics to non-human entities such as animals. These characteristics can include speech, or some of the cultural norms that we associate with being human, or things like wearing clothes, etc. Stories told from the point of view of animals are generally considered to be anthropomorphic fantasy. The Animals of Farthing Wood is one such book. It features a group of woodland creatures who are on a journey. It is a children's book, but that doesn't mean adults can't read it, so let's just get into it. First up, as usual, a spoiler-free summary. The Animals of Farthing Wood is a story about a group of animals who, when threatened by drought and land development around their home, Farthing Wood, decide to go on a journey to reach the safety of a nature reserve called White Deer Park. The characters include a fox, a badger, a tawny owl, a toad, a mole, a kestrel. You get the idea. A whole group, a variety of woodland creatures is represented as this fellowship travels through the British landscape to get to the nature reserve and encounter every kind of human-related danger you can think of, and I bet you can think of a few right off the top of your head. The question whether this kind of anthropomorphic fantasy is automatically ecofiction because it's told from the perspective of animals is one that I raised in my original video, and I said that that's up to every individual reader to decide for themselves. But for me personally, I still really prefer it to have a message, to still have some kind of environmental message that the story is telling. And this book hits you across the face with the effect that humans have on wild creatures. I mean, the inciting incident of the book is that humans have filled in the pond, which is pretty much the only water source available to wildlife in the area, and Farthing Wood has been shrinking more and more year by year as humans chop down the trees to develop the land for farming or building or what have you. Add to that the area is suffering from drought, and the animals have to make a decision that is literally a life and death situation. Remember that this book was written in the late 70s and Colin Dann was pointing out that land development was a problem then. Imagine how much of a problem it is now. Through this book you kind of experience a whole range of terrors that we humans have inflicted on wildlife for sport, like hunting, transport, like roads, and even just the careless flick of a cigarette that ends up burning down a patch of what should be safe cover for them. You also see humans through the eyes of these animals, which is usually framed with the phrase, "I will never understand humans," which I think is fair. I don't understand us most of the time. But the animals continuously return to these questions of how can humans treat their pets so much differently than they treat wildlife? How can humans so selfishly cater for their own needs that they ignore the needs of absolutely everything else? How can humans find pleasure in running a fox to death by exhaustion just for the fun of it? These are very good questions. But what is really interesting is that they also point out that there are good people. They make the point of saying there's so much variation in the human species that there are people who are as good as the horrible ones are horrible. And these are creatures known as naturalists. This had me howling. This was so funny to me. They call them naturalists. I found that very entertaining. And these are people who designate areas like White Deer Park, where no hunting is allowed, the land is safe from development, and animals can live in peace. And they do this just because they recognize the inherent value of wildlife. And the animals do meet a naturalist along the way, someone who is so excited to find a certain flower in a field, and they just sit and watch him, the same way that we would probably observe animals in order to study their behavior, so I found that quite entertaining. Now, the degree to which this story is anthropomorphism is probably up for discussion, because while the story is told from the perspective of animals, they only talk to each other. The story isn't trying to say that animals talk in a way that we can understand on any level. They also don't wear clothes or cook meals or anything. The natural behaviors of these animals is fairly well observed in terms of the food that they eat, whether they're nocturnal or diurnal, and where they sleep and things like that. Where the author does anthropomorphize a bit is this idea that when the woodland is under threat, animals would call an emergency meeting so they can communicate across species, no problem, and they would take an oath to travel to this safe place. A fox, a badger with some field mice and rabbits behind them, and they're carrying like a toad and a mole on their back. Colin Dann does hang a lantern on it though, because whenever this kind of motley crew is spotted by humans, they're completely baffled. They have absolutely no idea what they're seeing, and the animals themselves are aware that it's unusual. So not a nature documentary, but also not as anthropomorphic as you can get. In that original video that I did, I pointed out a study that found that the more anthropomorphic you make animals, it can actually negatively affect the amount of scientific facts that children can take from it. And I think Colin Dann kind of toes the line quite well with this book. I think children reading it would still learn something about these animals that is scientifically accurate, while still dramatizing it enough to engage their imagination. And judging by the popularity of the 90s TV show, children did respond very well to this band of animals. And that actually brings me to an interesting topic, which is one that kept popping up when I searched for discussion about Animals of Farthing Wood, and that is the death scenes. I found articles like 6 times the Animals of Farthing Wood traumatized us for life, and others that said, The Animals of Farthing Wood was the most brutal children's TV show ever. I mean, they are talking about the TV series here, and from the little excerpts and GIFs that are in those articles, I agree they are indeed brutal. And actually, this first book is no different. When the first death happened, I was like, hold on. I thought I was reading a kid's book. This is a book for children. It was so quick and without warning, and it just casually happened, and I was shook. I had to re-examine what I thought was meant by children's book. I guess this sits up there somewhere with Watership Down for nightmare fodder. I didn't know what butcher birds were, and now I do. And I kind of wish I didn't. And if you don't, Google at your own risk and with caution. I mean, I guess it would have been unrealistic for the entire group to survive the journey when they meet so many different dangers and they all reach White Deer Park happily, but still, yikes. And apparently the death and trauma continues in the sequels, so before you read this to your little darling as a bedtime story, maybe check out the TV show. But from what I hear, kids in the 90s loved this show, even with all of these traumatic events. I'm kind of annoyed I missed it. I don't think it really reached us in the US, or if it did, I was just completely oblivious. But on the other hand, it did save me from nightmares full of butcher birds, so an interesting book. It lulls you into this children's book, kind badger, clever fox, wise owl, and then bang! Humans are awful! Except naturalists. Naturalists are great. So I still enjoyed it overall. It reminded me a lot of the kinds of stories that I read growing up. I always loved stories about animals, and I still do apparently. I hope you've enjoyed this review of The Animals of Farthing Wood by Colin Dann. If you have, let me know in the comments, and also let me know if you were lucky or unlucky, depending how you look at it, enough to watch the TV show in the 90s. Remember to like this video and subscribe to my channel if you like content like this, and ring that bell so you get notified every time I post new content, which is every Wednesday and sometimes on Mondays. If you like what I do and would like to support me, then head on over to patreon.com/ecofictology and become a patron, where your monthly donation buys me my next book, but also supports the marine conservation organization Love the Oceans, operating out of Mozambique. If you want to find some community around ecofiction, then join us on our Discord server, Rewilding Our Stories, a safe space for ecofiction lovers of all kinds to share resources, collaborate, support each other, and generally nerd out over ecofiction. You can also join the Facebook group. Invite links for both of those are in the description below. So that's it from me, and I'll see you next week, Ecofictologists. A group of animals who, when wow, this is... Children did respond very well to this band of animals, blah 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 blah. And judging by the... wow!